Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's edition of the Northern Kentucky Forum. Sorry we're starting just a couple of minutes late, but want to give time for our guests to be admitted into the Zoom. So it's a little bit of technical work to accomplish that, but it's happening now. I am Mark Nykirk, the director of the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement at NKU. We are one of the partners in the Northern Kentucky Forum, along with the 3 public libraries in Boone and Campbell County. And we're committed to civil dialogue in our community. We have a special guest this evening from the Associated Press, and I'll introduce her in just a moment. But also I want to remind you that this is a busy week for us on the forum as we approach Election Day. Tomorrow night we have Tony Chavez, who teaches in the law school here at NKU, giving a talk on the voter suppression. So join us for that if you're able. And Thursday night, we are partners with the College of Informatics for a presentation by Dr. James Walden on cybersecurity and elections. So good week to get informed via the forum on election and campaign issues. So www.nkYforum.org, or follow us on Facebook, and you can see the RSVP for those events. We this evening have with us from Washington, D.C., Julie Pace. Julie is the Washington Bureau Chief of the Associated Press. We have been a partner with AP to bring a national journalist to Northern Kentucky every year for the past 12 years, I believe. And unfortunately, Julie, you have to be with us virtually. I'm sorry about that. One of the nice pieces of having an AP journalist in town is they're able also to meet with our students in person. And Julie did so this morning with a political science class. So we're doing what we can in the COVID world, and appreciate the ongoing partnership with the Associated Press. Julie came to this job. I'll let her tell you a little more, but it begins with AP saying, why don't you cover Barack Obama? He's just announced for president, probably won't win. Next thing you know, she's covering the White House and now is in her current job. And we're getting her in a particularly busy year and busy season, as you might imagine, all the news coming out of DC right now. So Julie is a native of Buffalo and has been with AP since 2007. Quick little note for everyone, the Associated Press, which we're accustomed to reading AP stories in our local newspaper, but AP also has an app that you can download on your phone and follow the news that AP provides in that way. So it's a relatively new a product for AP, and it's free and a good way to kind of stay up on current news from a news source that has a long and established reputation for factual news. It's not an opinion service. So Julie is going to talk for about 30 minutes or so and then take questions. You will see a Q&A and chat function. If you'll put your question in the Q&A, that works well, but we also can bring you up your video and sound to ask Julie your question directly if you prefer to do that, and it'd be great if you can. It helps kind of with the interaction of the evening. So just raise your hand or send us a note that you have a question, and Chris Strobel, who is my colleague at NKU and is kind of working all the tech in for us, will bring you up live to ask your question and dialogue with Julie. So let's get started. Julie, I'll give you the stage, so to speak.
Thank you so much, Mark. I am really happy to be with you all virtually. I'm so sorry that I couldn't make it to Northern Kentucky for this great event. I'm so glad that AP has been a partner with the university for so many years. It's, I think, one of the great privileges that we have in this job is to get to talk to the communities that we serve. My goal mostly, in addition to getting to take your questions and talk to you a little bit about the election is to get through this virtual presentation without either my toddler or my dog bursting through the room. Both have happened at other events that I have been speaking at. So if we can get through the event without either of that happening, I think we will consider that a success. It's Mark actually who suggested the title of this presentation, May You Live in Interesting Times. And it was so perfect when he suggested that, because it's a line that I actually have thought about quite a bit over the last year or so. It's actually meant to be a curse. It's an Irish curse. And I think many people probably feel that way about 2020. It's a year with a historic pandemic, this tense reckoning over race in this country, so much uncertainty around the economy, and obviously a heated presidential election. But as a journalist, it has been a real privilege to be able to help translate and explain these really interesting times to our readers, particularly for a news organization like the Associated Press, which is so dedicated to ensuring that local communities around the country and around the world have access to smart, sophisticated, and insightful coverage out of Washington. I find it, as I mentioned, a particular privilege to be able to talk to people in those communities, to learn from your insights as well. And so while I am sad that we cannot be together in person, I do look forward to answering your questions at the end of my presentation. I can tell you a bit about me first, and then we will jump right in. As Mark mentioned, I joined the Associated Press in 2007. It was right at the beginning of the 2008 presidential campaign. I started covering Barack Obama, this young upstart candidate who everyone thought would be exciting, but wouldn't necessarily make it to the presidency. And suddenly there he was in the White House, and there I was in the White House. And I spent 8 years covering the Obama administration. During the 2016 election, I did move on to cover Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. I moved into the White House with Trump at the beginning of his administration for about 6 months. Then I became bureau chief. In my current role, I oversee about 100 journalists, overseeing everything from presidential politics, Congress, foreign policy, domestic policy, the economy. We have a really wide swath of expertise in the Washington Bureau. And really in an election year, we put all of that reporting muscle really into different facets of the election, since it's not just an election about the candidates, it's very much about the voters and about the issues. I do think as we get toward the end of this campaign, it's worth taking a step back to look at how we got here. I sometimes find that this year has been so overwhelming for so many people that it's easy to lose track of where we started. As a political journalist, 2020 was always going to be interesting and busy given this election. President Trump headed into his re-election campaign on the back of a strong economy and nearly unanimous support from the Republican Party, particularly coming out of those impeachment hearings that the Congress held at the end of last year and at the beginning of this year. Democrats opened the year locked in a fight for their party's future and filled with deep anxiety over which candidate was best positioned to take on Trump in the general election. And Chris, if you could move on to the next slide here. That Democratic primary certainly got off to a rocky start. Remember the Iowa caucuses? It was a disastrous night for the party. Their voting systems and tabulation systems broke down, so much so that we at the AP didn't have enough confidence in the vote totals to declare a winner. That's an extremely unusual position for us. We felt both that race was so close and there were so many questions about the accuracy of the tally that we simply couldn't declare a winner. And I remember at the time, it felt like that was about the craziest thing that might happen in this year. We all felt like maybe we got that out of the way right from the start. Of course, little did we know. The primary actually moved quite quickly from there. After difficult finishes in both Iowa and New Hampshire, Joe Biden rebounded in South Carolina on the strength of his support from Black voters, and then essentially ended the race with sweeping victories across the country on Super Tuesday. And it was right about that time that everything really changed. The coronavirus pandemic shut down much of the country and really halted what we've all come to think of as traditional presidential campaigning. There were no more campaign planes flying around the country. There were no more big rallies being held. So how did we adjust? Well, like many of you, we at the AP had to abruptly start working from home. We shut down our Washington bureau on March 13th, and we haven't gone back since. The first time that a small group of us will actually be going back to the Bureau will be on election night. We have a small team really centered around our race call, around the presidency, who will be there. We're all quite excited, but it really will be the first time that we've been together in 7 months. We also, at that time in mid-March, pulled all of our campaign reporters off the road. This wasn't a particularly hard call, given, as I mentioned, that the campaigns also weren't having in-person events. I do think, though, both on our end and on the campaign's end, none of us really thought that that situation would last for quite as long as it did. Beyond the technical hurdles that we had to overcome in trying to figure out how to run a newsroom and cover a campaign from home, we had 2 other big things that we had to figure out. One was how the pandemic was going to change the campaign and change what voters really cared about, what they wanted to see from their candidates and from the next president of this United States. And 2 was how are we going to maintain our connection to those voters, since we didn't have reporters who could drop into battleground states, who could be talking to people in grocery store parking lots or Target parking lots, all of those great places where we would try to find people and get a sense of what was on their minds. Frankly, we didn't think that voters, even if we could be traveling, would be that comfortable in a pandemic talking to a random stranger, approaching them with a mask in the parking lot. And this is something that I worried about in particular coming off of the 2016 campaign. I've said this before, I am not a huge apologist for AP's coverage of the 2016 campaign, but I do think that one thing we failed to appreciate was just how frustrated Americans were with Washington and just how willing some of them were to try something completely new, to just throw out the old way of doing things. It's not that we weren't out there talking to voters and hearing this from them in 2016, but I do think that we gave too much credence to the conventional wisdom that told us they would ultimately go with more experience, like too much credence to the views of professional politicos, and didn't put as much stock as we should have in what those voters were really telling us. So now, here we were in 2020, in the middle of a campaign where we had vowed to do things differently, vowed to really invest in our coverage of voters, of the electorate, and our political team was largely grounded, unable to travel and talk to those voters. So how did we get around that? Well, one advantage that comes with being at the AP is that we have a national network. This is always one of the things that I have really appreciated about working at the AP. And at the outset of the presidential campaign, well before the pandemic was on our radar, we decided that we were going to really try to take advantage of that network. We decided we wanted to build a national political team that was not solely based in Washington or New York. It was really important to me that we had reporters who lived around the country, who were raising their families in the states and the communities that were going to decide this election. So we started this year with a political team that has reporters, yes, in Washington and New York, but also in places like Iowa, in South Carolina, Georgia, Colorado, Nevada, California, and several other states. We also at AP have a network of other reporters in all 50 states, and we've really relied on them to be our eyes and ears on what was happening on the ground. And we made sure that we were using the limited opportunities that we had to really get in front of key demographics, key voting blocks in this race. We made that commitment from the start. It meant when we were choosing to travel, we were going to be keeping an eye on the voters who we thought that the rest of this country really needed to hear from. The result is a package of journalism that I'm really proud of, America Disrupted. You'll see a couple of the examples here on the slide. It's a series of deeply reported stories with really amazing photos and video that look at different communities and different voting blocks, from Hispanic voters in North Carolina to Trump voters in small town Wisconsin, the power of Black women in this electorate, senior citizens in Florida. You can check out the whole series at apnews.com/hub/America Disrupted. And Chris, if you can go to that next slide, you can actually see the link at the bottom there. And I appreciate Mark making a nice plug for the AP app. You can see the America Disrupted series there. Obviously, the pandemic is just one of the major stories in this really historic year. The coronavirus has created enormous economic uncertainty for millions of Americans. And though some sectors of the economy have bounced back faster than was previously expected at the start of the pandemic, many Americans remain out of work, and many businesses, small businesses in particular, are facing a lot of uncertainty. Also uncertain is the prospect of more stimulus money from Washington. The country has also really been gripped by a reckoning over race, prompted by the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other Black Americans. We saw protests in the streets of numerous cities, most of which were peaceful, but some of which sparked looting and other violence. And this came at a time when Americans of color were already bearing the brunt of the pandemic, particularly in those first early months. With all of that in mind, I want to take a look at where the latest polling shows us this country is in these final weeks before the election. When it comes to the pandemic, 42% of Americans told us in our latest AP poll last week that they remain extremely or very worried that they or someone in their family will get coronavirus. 72% of Americans say they favor requiring people to wear masks outside of their home. And 61% of Americans believe that in this year where the economy has been so deeply impacted by the pandemic, that the US economy is either very or somewhat poor. So that's sort of the mood music for this election that we are in right now. And anytime you have an incumbent president that is on the ballot, the election is inherently something of a referendum on how they have done. So let's take a look at where President Trump stands heading into these final days of the campaign. I do think that when it comes to the economy, that last number that I showed you on that previous slide, with 61% of Americans saying they believe the economy is very or somewhat poor, is really relevant. Trump had expected to be running this year on a strong economy. That's where the year started. Now he has a trickier argument to make to voters. He has to make the case to Americans that the economy might not be where it was, but that it's not his fault. And if they reelect him, he can get them back there. His approval ratings on the economy do continue to be his best ratings in our surveys, but 49% right now say that they approve of his handling of the economy. That's down from 56% at the start of the year. So you can see the impact that the decline in the economy has had on his approval ratings around that issue. But it is far and away his best metric. When it comes to Trump's handling of the pandemic, just 33% of Americans say they approve. Just 35% say they approve of the president's handling of race relations. Overall, 39% of Americans say they approve of Trump's job performance. That is historically low for a US president, but it actually is pretty consistent with where Trump has been throughout his presidency. So where does that leave Trump 2 weeks from Election Day? And where does that leave his challenger, Democrat Joe Biden? What's pretty amazing about this presidential race is that the public polling has actually stayed pretty consistent since about midsummer, despite how tumultuous this year has seemed and how many big events it feels like have shaken this country. National polls for months have shown Joe Biden with a comfortable lead over Trump. But of course, we do not elect presidents in the United States on a national basis. We elect them by states. And so when you see the state polls, when you really dig into the state polls in those battleground states, you see a much closer race. You see in a lot of these places like Florida, Pennsylvania, you see a race that is in some cases well within the margin of error. So I always encourage people in this moment, while national polls get a lot of attention, really be paying attention to polls in the battleground states. Those are the places that will actually decide this election. Biden's campaign does feel quite good about their chances in some of those upper Midwest states that Trump won in 2016, the surprise wins that he pulled off in places like Michigan and in Wisconsin. The Biden campaign is also campaigning really aggressively in states like Georgia and Arizona that have reliably voted Republican in recent elections, but seem to be shifting to the left as their demographics change. We have historically seen in this country that as states get more diverse, as their demographics become more diverse, that those states become more democratic. The Biden campaign is also watching closely Texas. Ever since I started covering presidential politics way back in the 2008 campaign, Democrats have been talking about a state like Texas, waiting for it to come online for them. This is the first presidential race that I can remember where they have actually invested real resources to try to make that happen. Trump's campaign has been on the defense in these final weeks. The president has to find himself traveling not just to places like Florida and Pennsylvania, but he has to go to places that he won in 2016. He was just recently in Iowa. He's been in Ohio. Today, he was in Arizona. You know, if you're the Republican candidate, those are not the states where you want to have to be spending most of your time right now, but it does go to show where the president feels like he needs to shore up his base of support over these next 2 weeks. There are two things I would say that are giving the Trump team confidence. One of them, Florida. You've already heard me mention it a couple of times. I'll mention it again. Florida is that perennial battleground state, and Florida looks like it will be a battleground state again. The polls there are exceptionally close. If Trump can pull out a win in Florida, it really keeps his path to 270 electoral college votes open. The other big thing keeping the Trump campaign confident is the lessons of 2016 and the ways in which that race seemed to tilt in Trump's direction in the final days. We saw through exit polling that late-breaking voters, those voters who just weren't quite decided until the very end, overwhelmingly tilted in Trump's favor. And that is what the campaign is hoping for again. They believe that that is not something that can be measured in polls at that point. They believe that if he can be in these final few weeks, if he can make the case that he can bring the economy back in 2021, that those late deciders will again break his way. So that brings us to election night. I know there are a lot of questions about how election night will look this year. Some of us were talking about this a little bit before the panel got started, and probably a lot of questions about what you can expect, when we'll call the race. I will do my best to answer as many of those as possible for you. I do want to talk a little bit about the AP's unique role in American elections. We have been counting the vote and declaring winners of elections since 1846. And I've been thinking about that year a lot in this year. And I do that because 1846 means that we have been calling races at the AP through wars, through civil unrest, through pandemics, and we've done so successfully. So while this year is certainly a challenge, I am really confident that based on our history, we can call this presidential race and so many others successfully. We actually will call more than 7,000 races at the AP. That is everything from the presidency down to state legislative races across the country. So how do we do it? We have a team of 5,000 stringers, including some students from Northern Kentucky, who deploy around the country. These are really our folks on the front lines. They are talking with county officials. They are the first ones to help get votes tabulated from these counties. I think people always find it kind of amazing, given how large this country is and how sophisticated we are in most ways, to think about the ways that we actually tabulate votes. Some counties have quite sophisticated operations. Others, it's literally a county clerk handing over a piece of paper to an AP stringer with a little tally of what the vote was. And that's how we get our first glimpse of what the vote looks like in a lot of these places. That massive stringer network that AP has in all of these places really gives us a leg up. Then we have a team of race analysts. These are people who have spent weeks and months really digging into specific states and specific races. Some of these folks have been covering and analyzing these races, these states for AP for several years. They know the rules for counting votes in specific counties. They know what counties are able to get the vote in fast, which ones are going to take a little bit slower. They know the historical voting patterns in these states. They've been studying public polling. These are the people who will be able to take those numbers that our stringers are collecting and start to dig in and analyze them and get a sense of where the race will go. On the biggest races for US President and the US Senate, our analysts will recommend a race call to our decision desk. They're the ones who will finalize when we're able to call the big races. I'll be there alongside them for the presidency, and then we will send an AP news alert out to the world. So, what to expect on election night? I would like to give you guys a little bit of detail to give you some confidence in how prepared and professional our race calling operation is. But I know that the big question everyone really has is, when will we know a winner? And I certainly wish that I could tell you that. The reality is that depends on a lot of different factors. The biggest factor is simply how close this race is between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. The closer that race is, the longer it will take to declare a winner. That's probably no big surprise. There are other factors we have to consider as well. One is the speed of the vote tabulation. In some key states, we are expecting that the vote will be tabulated slower because of an increase in mail-in voting due to the pandemic. We're in a situation in this country where we have seen mail-in vote really increase naturally over the last several years, but there's just been a huge acceleration in mail-in voting during the pandemic because more people are worried about the health risks of going and voting at the polls. But the result of that is you have states who are doing years worth of work to catch up on their voting systems and on their rules around mail-in voting in a matter of months. We have states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, two very important states in this election, who are still finalizing rules for when mail-in vote can be counted. And that's really, really crucial to us. That goes to this question of how quickly we can know a winner. In a state like Pennsylvania, right now, the rules dictate that we won't be able to know they won't be able to start counting mail-in vote until on election day. So all of that mail-in voting that is arriving at offices right now is just sitting there waiting to be counted. A state like Florida, though, actually allows mail-in voting to be counted much earlier, which means that there's a pretty good chance that we actually could know a winner of Florida's election on election night. If I can leave you with one thing to keep in mind about this, one thing to pass on to your friends and family, it's that not knowing who the winner is on Tuesday night, November 3rd, doesn't necessarily mean that anything went wrong. It most likely means that this is a close race and the vote counting process is slow. You may hear people, including politicians, make claims of fraud if we don't know the winner, but the reality is that the prospects of widespread voter fraud of ending this race are exceedingly low. Even though our elections in the US are complicated and a little messy, there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud. So again, a slow count and no results on election night probably doesn't mean that something has gone wrong. We are, of course, planning for all kinds of contingencies, including voting issues, legal challenges that could hold up the election results, prospects of protests and unrest, given how tense this year has been around the country. We also have a team focused on foreign interference, though US officials tell us at this point they have not seen any indications of foreign actors infiltrating any voting systems. So before I get to your questions, though, I'll try to anticipate at least one of them. And that is what to watch on election night. Florida. I told you I would mention Florida again. Florida is actually one of those states, as I said, that counts the vote pretty quickly. So there's a good possibility that we could call Florida on election night, even if we can't call the race for president overall. If we call Florida, if the AP calls Florida for Joe Biden, that means that this is going to be a good night for him. That really closes off a lot of Trump's pathways to 270 electoral college votes. But if we call Florida for the president, his path to 270 very much remains open. Texas. I mentioned Texas earlier, one of those states that Democrats have really been keeping an eye on. The demographics in Texas keep moving toward Democrats. Trump won Texas by 9 points in 2016. That's a pretty comfortable win. But just 2 years later, Democrat Beto O'Rourke only lost his Senate race in Texas by 2 points. A lot of the polling that we are seeing right now, the public polling around the presidential race in Texas, puts it much closer to that Senate race from 2018 than the presidential in 2016. Finally, those upper Midwest battleground states. These were the big surprise in 2016. I remember sitting in AP's at Washington Bureau on election night, and the head of our decision desk, I was writing the main presidential story, very focused on Florida, very focused on Pennsylvania, Ohio. And I remember the head of our decision desk pretty early in the night turning over to me and saying, keep an eye on the Midwest. And I thought, that's funny. And as the night went on, he kept saying, watch Michigan, watch Michigan. Then we called Michigan for Trump. That was a huge sea change in American politics there. Then all eyes were on Wisconsin. And I remember the moment that we called Wisconsin was the same moment we were able to call the presidential race. And I was actually on the phone with the Trump campaign. They were calling me, calling the AP to try to find out when we were going to be able to call Wisconsin, when we knew that Wisconsin was going to go for Trump. I was on the phone with them. Our decision desk said, we can call Wisconsin for Donald Trump. I passed it on to the Trump campaign. I said, we just moved the news alert on it. And they said, okay, the AP called Wisconsin. And I said, well, we called Wisconsin, but we also called the presidency. He's going to be president. And there was silence on the other end of the line. And then they just hung up on me. I think that it was a little bit of a shocking moment for them as well. But it's a big question, truly, about whether Trump can rebound in those Midwestern battleground states this time around. He has focused so much of his energy on that, yet the polling does suggest that he is behind. This will be a real test of whether he can ramp up his turnout in some of the conservative strongholds in these states and pull back some of those voters in Wisconsin and Michigan, a lot of those working class, traditionally Democratic voters who really took a chance on Donald Trump 4 years ago. And with that, I would really love to take your questions.
So Julie, let me just remind the audience, if you just raise your hand, you can put the question in the Q&A or raise your hand and Chris will look for you and recognize you and you can ask the question directly. While we're waiting to get a couple of questions in, let me pose one if I could. We had a student this morning who referenced the Hunter Biden computer, and it reminds me generally of, I wonder if you could talk about what kind of conversations go on with the AP News team around things that are sort of the October surprise, maybe a little bit of history on that and where we are now. There's been a lot of criticism of the press for not covering the Hunter Biden emails the same way at the level that some people think it should be covered. So yeah, just if you could reflect on that, take us inside that decision process.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to. Sometimes I wish that we could have some of our news meetings and our discussions in public, because I actually think that a lot of our readers, Americans, would find those conversations and the decisions you have to make and the questions you have to ask in those moments really interesting and thought-provoking. You know, on the overall idea of an October surprise, I think after the 2016 election, you know, we are all braced and have been for the prospect of surprising developments, you know, in the final weeks of this campaign. I think that we just live in an era right now where anything is possible. Obviously, they're surprises by nature, so we can't, you know, predict and prepare for all of them. But basically, you know, when we have something that happens, something significant that happens, particularly if it seems to involve some kind of leaked material that did not get leaked to us, that we don't have access to, which is the situation that, you know, every news organization besides the New York Post, you know, is in right now, that we don't actually have access to any of these materials. We can't do any verification on our own. We have to go essentially through a checklist. We go through and we ask, you know, how can we verify this material? Is there a way that we can independently verify where this came from? Who seems to be pushing this material? Do they have a political motivation that we can ascertain? In this situation, the answers to those first two questions were we couldn't verify because of the way the New York Post published that material. We couldn't verify the authenticity of the emails. And we did know that the people pushing the material do have a political motivation. It's Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon, two close advisors to the president. And we do know that the Justice Department, the Trump Justice Department, has said that a person that Rudy Giuliani has been working with over the last several months is tied to a Russian disinformation campaign aimed at discrediting Joe Biden. So when we look at that in totality, it doesn't mean that we ignore it. It just means we have to provide our readers with a lot of context. It's really important to know as a reader, not just what something says, but why it is out there, who is pushing it, what their ties are. And so on the first day that after the New York Post published their story, we did about 1,000-word, 1,200-word story at AP that really tried to dig into all of these questions. We tried to explain to people, you know, what Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's ties to Ukraine were. We tried to explain what we knew and also, really importantly, what we didn't know. I think we have to be honest with readers about what we don't know in these situations. We tried to explain, you know, some of the ways that the political campaigns were responding to this. We tried to explain, as I mentioned, you know, Rudy Giuliani's history with Ukraine. I think if you read that piece, you know, it's a really fair and it's a really clear assessment of what is known and what isn't known. And I think, you know, that is the best service that we can give to readers on any October surprise right now, is to take a deep breath, ask some questions. As I like to say in our newsroom, we report our way through these stories, right? We don't hot take our way through these stories. We really report our way through these stories. And I think that, you know, readers of the AP have had an opportunity to hopefully learn from our coverage and make a decision on their own about what they take away. That's my biggest goal, is not to shape how people interpret these events, not to push them in either direction, but to give them facts, to give them an opportunity to you know, read the same set of facts and make their own decision about what they take away from them.
Thank you. We have a question from JC Morgan, and I believe that he is being unmuted now. So, JC.
Hi,
All
JC.
right. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I didn't expect to be unmuted. I just put my questions up there. I asked two questions. What did you think of the dueling town halls? And then what are we going to expect at this next debate?
Both good questions. Well, logistically, I can tell you that the dueling town halls made it pretty difficult for us as a reporting team because we had to figure out how we were going to watch and cover both of them at the same time. So we basically just assigned two different teams of reporters, to watch each of them. I tried to flip back and forth. What's so interesting, having watched both of these candidates for so long, I covered Trump when he was a candidate and covered him in the White House. I covered Joe Biden when he was vice president, and I've covered him, on this campaign as well, is they kind of are who they are. You don't get huge surprises tonally with them. You don't get huge surprises in their approach. We saw President Trump, be pretty combative with the moderator. That's his style. He likes the combat. He likes to push back. He likes to be aggressive in that format. You saw Joe Biden give kind of these long, soliloquies on lots of history in them, lots of going back, to the old days to tell how like the way things were. They are just two very different candidates. And I think what was, in my mind, unfortunate for Americans is that because of the way those were set up is you had to choose, or you had to flip back and forth. It's not as fulfilling, I think, as it is to see these two candidates standing side by side. And I don't know how many Americans at this point were, TiVoing the second one and going back to watch, 3 hours of town halls in the middle of their work week. But we do expect that we will get the candidates back on the same stage this week. The second debate, the town hall style debate, was canceled after the president's illness. I think that there are a couple of things to keep in mind going into this debate. Given the current dynamic of the race, Trump does need to have something in this race change. He needs to change the trajectory of this race. So he's got to figure out, what can he do in this debate to make that happen? And who are the voters that he needs to appeal to try to make that happen? His campaign is particularly focused right now on two sets of voters. One are senior citizens, older voters who supported him in 2016, but particularly are unhappy with his handling of the pandemic. And two are white suburban women who have all but abandoned the Republican Party, over the last couple of years and are a little more turned off by Trump's demeanor, his tone, his personality than any of his policy positions. And so, he's got a little bit of a needle to thread there as he tries to win over, some of those voters. Certainly he won't be able to win over all, but at least, some of them. How does he try to structure his responses to Biden? Does he go really aggressive again? There was a lot of kind of interrupting, a lot of back and forth in that first debate. Does he try to be, take a little bit of a back seat and try to and this is what some of his advisors would like him to do, try to essentially let Joe Biden make a mistake, let him talk longer, let him get his answers out, and hope that that voters, see him as maybe a little shakier than he looked in that first debate.
Julie, we have a question from John Lindley.
Hi. Yeah, I was just, my question was, assuming it does end up being a close race in some of the battleground states, Pennsylvania, Florida, wherever, and it does come down to mail-in ballots, what's the longest timeline we could be looking at to find out? I mean, I was in high school when there was the Florida recount for Bush, and I remember that being a big deal, even though it was not that long of a process. How long potentially could this go?
Yeah, that's a really good question, John. So there are a couple of things that we, a couple of dates on the calendar that we are watching. The biggest one is that, I'm sure, most of you know this, but again, in our complicated system, of elections in America, you're actually not voting for a candidate directly. You're voting for electors. You're voting for members of the Electoral College. And those electors actually meet. There is a date that they go and they get together and they cast their ballots for the candidates. That's in mid-December. And actually, the 2000 example is a really great one because one of the reasons that the Supreme Court moved on the time frame it did is that they wanted to have a resolution before the electors met. They wanted to have some certainty around it. So, we expect that if we got into a situation where there was a very slow count in states, that probably would bring along some legal challenges just based on, what we know about the ways that the parties are preparing. You could expect that there would be various legal challenges thrown up to either speed up or slow down the count. But we also expect that the courts, based on the precedent of 2000, will be watching that meeting of the electors very closely. And they don't want to get into a situation where we go beyond the meeting of the electors without some clarity about what's happened in some of these key states. Because if that happens, we're in really unprecedented territory. No one quite knows what happens. There's a process where this goes to the House. We haven't been there. So we really expect that the courts, again, using the 2000 model, will try to wrap up any legal challenges, which would answer some of these questions, in some of these battleground states by the time the electors meet. I am certainly hoping that it's a lot faster, because that is several weeks after Election Day. And I think after this year, most Americans are probably hoping that things will wrap up a lot faster. But that feels to me like the outer band.
Just remind everybody, put your questions in the Q&A and we'll call you up. But we have a next question from Patrick Curran.
Hi. My question, I was trying to read here on the screen, is what's your plan to reach out to conservative voters who tend to get most of their news now from Fox or Breitbart or blogs, OAN, etc., that they don't follow, national news, TV, or AP, I don't think either.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, Patrick. And I think about that a lot. I think one of the things that is really unique about the AP is that, we are everywhere. So if you live in a red state or you live in a blue state, there's a pretty good chance that AP news is going to end up in front of you in some way. You might not always know that it's AP. Some, papers or websites label it that way. Some are a little, trickier in how they label it. But there's a pretty good chance that AP is getting in front of you. And I take that on, as our Washington bureau chief, as this great responsibility and opportunity, and I think this applies not just to people who are getting their news, conservatives who are getting their news almost exclusively from conservative leaning outlets, but also liberals who are getting their news almost exclusively from liberal leaning outlets. In both of those instances, you have people who are basically in an echo chamber. You're basically only hearing what you already agree with, and you're going to be predisposed to believe what they tell you. You're almost getting no challenging information put in front of you. I do think that the AP is that place. We are the ones that can cut through. Breitbart, for example, is an AP member. Every now and then on Breitbart, a story shows up, from the AP, and sometimes they probably, don't want it on there, but every now and then it shows up. And to me, that's our opportunity, right? Not to change what people think. I don't want to change how people vote. I don't want to change people's political preferences. I just want to give them some nonpartisan, fact-based news. I want to give them some context around some of what they're hearing. I want to maybe challenge them to think about it from another perspective, just to see what they think about that perspective. Not, again, because I'm trying to push them in that direction, but literally that situation you're talking about, how we try to reach those Americans is like what our whole job is about. It is hard. I don't pretend like, most people are, right now, especially given how heated the political climate is, that most people are willing to have, their opinions changed or even willing to say, I'm going to take a second look at that, that story because I read this AP story. But I do hope that over time, the getting some of those stories and that information in front of people does have, an effect. It does make people think, about the news sources that they are relying on. Am I really getting the best information from this news source? Should I maybe look to get, a different set of information here? And again, I would apply that to both sides, people who are really kind of in the echo chamber on partisan driven news organizations. But, it's I think a big challenge for us as journalists. And I think, again, for the AP, because of who we are and who our audience is, it's also this really great opportunity, if we can be the one story that somebody reads that is nonpartisan and is fact-based, again, huge opportunity for us.
The questions are coming in, so just a reminder, put it in the Q&A and we'll get to you. We have a question, Julie, from C. Klugman about really around fact checking, but
yeah. So fact checking has been a major part of our. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to jump in? Sorry.
No. You're cooking with gas. Go right ahead.
Okay, I will carry on then. Let me know if I'm not answering it correctly. Fact checking has been a major part of our bureau at the AP for quite some time. We really, we like to say that before there was PolitiFact, there were the AP fact checks, and we have a team of reporters that has been stood up around that operation for quite some time. It has definitely taken on, new urgency in the Trump administration. We fact check everybody. We are an equal opportunity fact checking operation. We fact check Joe Biden. We fact check Kamala Harris. We fact check Senate candidates. We fact check governors, but we definitely fact check Trump. And, I think that it's important that we acknowledge that Trump is disseminating more falsehoods than we are used to from American presidents. And his supporters, some of his top allies will also acknowledge that. So I'm not making a partisan statement when I say that. People who work around him make clear that some of the strategy behind this, is to cause a little bit of confusion and to cause a little bit of disinformation. And I think he has a higher tolerance for that than a lot of politicians. I also think that a lot of politicians really care if they're getting fact checked and really care if the AP says that's not true. This is actually what is true. Trump is a little bit immune to that, which I think also makes him, more willing to repeat something that has been repeatedly fact checked. But I would put these, fact checks in, a similar category to what I, mentioned to the previous questioner, which is, this to me is just an opportunity. This is not a personal thing. I'm not trying to get Donald Trump. I'm not trying to get Joe Biden, gotcha, in a falsehood. I'm trying to give people information and trying to give them facts and context. We're really aggressive in our fact checks about spelling out where we are getting our information from. If we're going to tell somebody that the president of the United States or another politician said something, that is inaccurate, I think there's a high bar for us to explain why that is, to be really forthcoming, really transparent about, spelling out why we have come to the conclusion that we have. And again, not doing it in a snarky way, not doing it in a way that is going to immediately turn somebody off who is a supporter of President Trump. Because ultimately, whether you support Trump or Biden or somebody else, I want you to have facts and I want you to be armed with the best information possible. If you can read an AP fact check and say, oh, that's interesting, I didn't realize that was inaccurate. I still really like Donald Trump. I like what he did with the economy. Great, excellent, right? But I gave you facts. Like that to me, again, is the biggest motivator that I have, not changing your opinion on someone.
Mr. Klugman, I want to give you the opportunity for a follow-up since I kind of asked your question for you. Sorry about that, but do you have a follow-up question or any further commentary or question?
I don't know, I think he's muted. I don't know if he knows.
Yeah, you're muted if you're asking if you're. Okay. Well, we'll move
Okay.
on.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. How do you deal, Julie, with Trump's falsehoods that he tells when he's campaigning or at a news conference, and he tells something that is just incorrect? How do you deal with that in the moment in your stories?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think we have, again, and I would make clear, this is not our approach just for Trump. This is for any politician, that says something that is inaccurate. My biggest sort of mantra in our bureau is that we're not going to put out falsehoods on their own. There probably was an era at the AP and other news organizations where, we're in a breaking news business, right? We just, President of the United States says something, you just put it out, right? And I think we have to be better than that right now. I think we have to be careful, and we have to know that the information that we put out travels really, really quickly. And so if a politician says something in the moment that is clearly not accurate, even if they're the president of the United States or they're a presidential candidate or a senator, we are under no obligation to just put that back out to people. The actual obligation and the responsibility that we have is, if we are going to write about it, to put some context around it. And I would put voter fraud as one of those things that we spent a lot of time, crafting language around. There is no widespread voter fraud in this country. Election after election, yes, there have been little problems on the margins in some places. As I've mentioned, it's kind of a messy electoral process, but in terms of actual fraudulent vote, we have not had that in the US. And that is something that the president, continues to say. Anytime he says that, if we feel like it is relevant, to fact check that in real time, then we do that. We cite studies, we cite officials, we make clear that Trump's, own campaign is pushing voters to do mail-in voting, which is what he says is particularly fraudulent. So we really do build in a lot of that fact-checking material in real time. We don't reserve it just for a special separate, fact-checking session or section. We make sure that it's in all of our regular copy. And sometimes that means that we have to move a little slowly, that we have to just, if it's something that's totally brand new to us that we don't really know, is that accurate? Is that inaccurate? Is that, spin? How much truth is there to that? If we have to take a little more time to figure that out and wait to publish, I much prefer doing that. I think that actually that is, something I would encourage, a lot of my colleagues at other news organizations to do, to just take a little time, because once you press the button, once that information is out in the world, if you haven't put some fact checking around it and some context around it, it can be used in all kinds of ways, and you lose control, and you lose the opportunity to inform people.
Julie, we're going to go to Dave Malaska, whose question is very similar. Obviously, there's interest in this, but I want to make sure if what Dave has on his mind has been answered.
Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thanks, Buffalo Girl, for coming out tonight.
Go Bills! I know. I didn't know there would be a 5 o'clock game tonight. What's the score?
Yeah, well, it's I've got it on in the background. Yeah, my question was similar. That in this era of alternative facts. Has the AP increased the manpower you have on the fact-checking teams? And, you mentioned the town halls covering, you had 2 separate teams. How much of those efforts were just fact-checkers?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So yes, we definitely have increased the number of people around our fact-checking operations. We have a team of, we have an editor and 4 reporters who are just focused on fact checks, but really all of our sort of expert beat reporters participate in this as well. So if you're, the beat reporter covering energy, or the beat reporter covering, the military, or covering, any number of issues, veterans affairs, we'll bring you in, around debates, around big speeches, town halls, to add your expertise to it. So that fact checking team is really backed, essentially by the whole, power of our Washington bureau. We definitely set up a fact checking team around the town halls. We do it during the debates. I think if you sometimes look, if you find, online, or if you go to the app, which, we've really been peddling here tonight, there's a whole fact check section on the app, and you can look at some of those stories, and you'll see that there might be 3 bylines and 10 contributors, on those stories, which just gives you a real sense of how many resources we throw around, some of this stuff. It's a pretty, it's a pretty robust operation for sure.
We have a question from Ellie Sadia that's also kind of in this vein, but Ellie, if you want to, I'm not sure I'm saying your name correct. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you want to go ahead?
Ellie has stepped away.
Okay. Well, her question, Julie, was really in the same line as how do we differentiate false information, disinformation from what we see in the media. So aside from relying on AP, what advice would you give us as news consumers?
That's a really good question, and actually one I really like answering. Look, I think so much of what we've been talking about tonight focuses on the media and our understandable role in so much of what we're talking about. But I also think that there's a really important role that news consumers, that Americans have right now. I think that we live in a climate where you can get your information, as I mentioned, from only places that already say what you want to hear. You don't have to be challenged in any way. We increasingly live in communities that are politically polarized, and I think that it becomes harder and harder to find news sources that are not partisan. It's hard work, but I would also really encourage people to do that. To just ask yourself, when you're reading something or watching something, is this actually unbiased, or is this actually pushing an agenda? It's okay to say, I really like watching this or reading this and it's pushing an agenda. You just have to know that that's what's going on. And then think, do I want to be challenged? Do I want to just have a sense of what's going on, in that other party, or what those other people might be thinking about? And sometimes I find when people really do try to challenge themselves to do that, it's not that they totally change their minds. It just gives them more perspective. And actually what it ends up doing sometimes is strengthening your convictions and what you believe in, and making you have to, figure out a little more clearly why I believe in this and be able to defend it a little more easily because you are challenged a bit. So there is definitely, I think, a news consumer, piece in this. The other big thing I would really say is, beyond the partisan media, there's this huge challenge that we're facing in this country right now around just misinformation, things that are not partisan, they're just wrong. It's just inaccurate information. And the way that it flies around social media, to me, is really quite scary. And so I would really encourage you, if you read something and it seems kind of out there, just check out the source that it came from. Do a little, be an active consumer of news, not a passive consumer of news. Really kind of try to check out what.
So I think our audience likes this topic. Cheyenne Meredith has a question for you that I think kind of derives from this, but also takes it a little further about what is the what about censorship. But let me let Cheyenne ask her question specifically. Cheyenne, if you can unmute and ask your question, that'd be great.
Oh, I think Cheyenne says her mic is out.
Oh, okay. Let me try to do justice. When your work disagrees with the facts presented with the current administration, do you ever experience unusual difficulty in getting the article to print? Computer or tech problems? And maybe we can push that forward too, is not only what's happening to you now, but do you worry about this as a future threat at all?
Yeah, I think that's probably a question about, whether there's some kind of, censorship going on. No, I mean, we've never had that. We've never had that issue. Certainly, at the AP, where we operate all over the world, and, journalists who work in other countries have sometimes had, challenges like that. We've not experienced that in the US under any administration, and I'm pretty confident that, as much as it sometimes seems like all the rules are being broken and all of the guardrails are falling by the wayside, I'm pretty confident that there's enough of a healthy respect for the media that if something like that were to happen, that there would be some pretty enormous pushback, and certainly we would make that very clear that crosses a line.
Cheyenne observes that she has that problem on Facebook when she posts things that disagree with the common narrative.
And I would say, I'm not Cheyenne. I don't know what exactly those circumstances have been, but I actually think it's sort of a great example of where, Facebook is not a news organization, right? And they're playing by a different set of rules. There are algorithms, there are, all kinds of competing interests there. As a news organization, we control, our own publishing. And I do think that, at least on those social platforms, we've not run into any problems with getting our information out.
John Lindley has another question for you. If we could go back to John, and has to do with a backlash from both sides.
Yeah, I was just curious, given that many people do get their information, kind of in a bubble, whichever side they happen to be on, do you ever find that your organization's accused of bias by one side or another? If you publish something positive about Trump or positive about Biden, do you get a lot of backlash from whichever side that upsets? And that, if so, does it affect the way that you frame the way your articles are written to try and avoid that?
No, is the short answer to your last question. On your first question, I live in the backlash zone. All I get is backlash, John. And that's okay. It is sort of funny sometimes. I think, sometimes, people, I think, have a very different, people who work in politics have a very different impression of the role of journalists than I do. I'm not trying to, curry favor with anybody. I'm not trying to get access to anybody. I'm not trying to represent, one position or another. So if you looked at the work that I've done over the last, 12 years that I've been in Washington, I've written stories that would be deemed positive about Republicans and stories that would be deemed negative about Republicans. I've written stories that have been deemed positive about Democrats and stories that have been deemed negative about Democrats. There was one day covering the Obama administration. I can't remember what the story was or what the moment was, but in the course of one day, I wrote a story that Republicans, opponents of the president thought was just like so soft on him. And I was the worst journalist that had ever existed. And then he held a news conference later that day, and I was asking him questions, and I was pushing him pretty aggressively on some stuff. And then I was the hero of Republicans, pushing the president and holding him to account. And to me, it's, that's just the job. That's the territory. I don't come at this trying to, take a side on this. And I don't want people to be able to read my coverage or watch, my coverage and be able to sort of glean what they think my politics is. And that does mean backlash, and that's okay. I told the journalism students earlier today, that is, you have to, one of the things when you get into this business is you gotta have a pretty thick skin. You have to know that you're going to come in for a lot of criticism, and you have to be okay with that. You have to know that, people are not going to like you and they're not going to like what you write. And as long as the reason that, they don't like you isn't because you got something truly wrong, like they can disagree with the way you framed something. They can say, I don't believe you. But if it's right, if you've done your work, you've reported your way through that story, and people, want to have, a field day on Twitter about it, like, it's okay. It doesn't bother me. I know that it's coming. Sometimes I wish people had more things to do with their free time than to go after me or other, journalists on Twitter, but it very much comes with the territory, and that's okay.
Julie, we've taken about an hour of your time in a very busy period of your life, I know, so thank you for this. I would like to ask one question before we depart, a Kentucky question. We
Go
have
for it.
A majority leader in a contested race, and just curious how our state registers on the national radar.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think that Mitch McConnell has definitely put Kentucky, on the map in terms of national politics. He has had some challenges over the last, political challenges over the last 2 cycles, that ultimately, he in the last election was able to overcome, and certainly Republicans, feel, and McConnell's campaign feels quite comfortable about his race against Amy McGrath right now. McGrath has generated a ton of money and interest from Democrats around the country. I think sometimes these fundraising numbers, we are seeing, a similar situation in South Carolina with the Lindsey Graham, Jamie Harrison race. Sometimes these fundraising numbers for the challengers get just so much attention. I think that number for Amy McGrath probably has a lot more to do with national Democrats being, frustrated with McConnell and wanting to push him out of office than it does with voters in Kentucky. I think, anybody can donate to any state that they want, so it's not necessarily reflective of what's happening on the ground. But certainly, I think, I would expect, unless there is a major shift in these last, 2 weeks here, that Mitch McConnell will be reelected. And then the question is he majority leader or is he minority leader? And what does he want to do if he's in the minority leader role? What's Mitch McConnell's desire in Washington to stay on in that capacity? That to me is a really interesting subplot of all of this.
Well, any parting thoughts to leave us with?
No, this has been great. You all have had such wonderful questions, and I've appreciated your insights and your interest in all of this. Like I said, my 2 main takeaways for you: we can't call the race on Tuesday night. It probably doesn't need fraud. And be active news consumers. I think there's so much good information out there, so many things that you can do to be an informed voter or just an informed citizen. And I would really encourage you to be proactive in that. And if you do, I think you'll find, again, that there's so much great journalism out there. I hope some of it is AP journalism. And I hope to hear from many of you. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm around. Would love to stay in touch and look forward to, hopefully getting a chance to answer your questions again sometime.
Well, thank you. And I wish we could unmute everyone. You would hear a big round of applause. I think the audience has been very appreciative of you being with us. So we appreciate all that and these insights and for fielding our questions. And audience, I remind you that the forum will be back tomorrow night to look at the history of voter suppression, and later in the week on cybersecurity issues and voting. So NKYForum.org will let you go directly to the RSVP sites for that. And we also welcome your suggestions on topics for the future. So thanks for being with us. Tell your friends to follow the forum on Facebook. And Julie, again, thank you, and thank the Associated Press for being with us.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.